Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vikri, Venlil volunteer crewman of UNS Cardinal. Date, standardized human time, October 29, 2136, 12 days after the Battle of Earth. The Gojid writhed futilely against the ropes, rolling about in the snow as she whined on the ground. It was a pathetic display, but I knew I'd be doing the same thing if I were in her position, with no knowledge of how humans operate. She was sure she would be eaten, mauled, or tortured to death. God, would you please shut her up? Grant spat. How? There's nothing more I can do short of suffocating her, Reese replied. Tenga approached. His mountainous figure cast a long shadow over where the Gojid lay, blotting out the morning light of Sol as he stood over her. He knelt down, resting a frosted spear over his lap as he seemed to observe her for a second. Stop screaming, or you will die. The Gojid froze as she stared up at the predator, tears soaking her face. Raspy panting squeaked out from the rope binding her mouth. That's what you want, right? To survive? His voice was different. It sounded so plain, soft even, but his timbre carried a silent threat. A growl rumbled beneath his words that was so subdued but perceptible enough to terrify any creature. Even Grant and Reese seemed put off by it. They glanced at each other as Reese took a breath and walked away from the scene. The Gojid didn't reply but continued gawking up at the predator, her breathing maintaining the same rapid pace. The creature that your people encountered in that cave is still alive. It's out there, and it's very angry. It has no interest in eating you. It has an interest in tearing you to shreds before it succumbs to its wounds. So, unless you want to meet the same fate as your comrades, stop screaming. He narrowed his eyes downward as he met her gaze. The Gojid's breathing slowed slightly as she seemed to take her attention off Tenga for a moment to scan the surrounding forest. Her screaming died down to soft, squeaky whines that escaped her throat. Her eyes shut tight as tears rolled down her face. The panic had been replaced with dread. As of right now, you are a prisoner of war, Tenga said plainly. Despite whatever your misguided perception of us might be, we have rules. You will not be tortured, and you will certainly not be eaten. He poked at the spikes on the Gojid's back. You don't seem particularly edible anyway. I'm not carrying that, Grant said, pointing down at the terrified survivor. She's got legs, let her walk, Reese replied. I don't trust her not to run. Tenga rolled the Gojid over. That's what ropes are for. He tied a line to the loops binding her paws and began cutting the restraints from her feet with a knife. Get up. Unless you want us to leave you here for the grizzly. The Gojid shakily stood up from out of the snow with some less than gentle assistance from Tenga. Her eyes were glassed over with tears as she gazed at the ground, trembling. Just looking at her, I could feel the aching fire coursing through her blood. In her mind, she was already dead. Vic, see what's in that bag, his voice changed back to its normal, even tone. I swished my tail over the snow and nodded, a bizarre mix of two types of body language, and approached the assortment of items lying on the ground near the boulder. On the surface of the mess, it appeared to be the contents of a basic survival kit, rations, rope, first aid, and even some fire starters. I jumped up to grab the bag from atop the rock and was surprised by its heft. There was still something inside. I tore it open and saw a small, rectangular device. I pulled it out and studied it. A wide display dominated one of its faces, flanked by buttons on either side. A row of smaller buttons and switches populated the top of it. Its construction was rugged, made entirely of metal. The glass on the front was cracked, and the red paint on the metal body was almost wholly scratched or scuffed off, but it seemed otherwise intact. I dropped the bag in the snow and began curiously pressing buttons and flipping switches on the device. It yielded no results. I figured it must be dead. I held the device in the air as I turned toward the rest of the group. Got something interesting. What is it? Grant asked. I'm guessing it's some kind of communicator or data pad. It's dead, but it seems functional enough. We've got some batteries, think you could wire it up? This thing doesn't seem like it was designed to be taken apart, I pointed out as I turned the device in my paws. A port on one side didn't look like anything I'd seen. I'm not even sure they'd charge this. Either way, it might have some important data on it. I handed it to Tenga, who did his own short inspection. Maybe our new friend could tell us, Reese said as he approached. The lieutenant shook his head. The most we're getting out of her right now is screaming and hyperventilating. Tenga looked down at the Gojid. She didn't make eye contact with anyone the entire time we spoke. She seemed zoned out in her own head. I wondered what she must be thinking. Tenga sighed. Pick up those supplies. We'll figure out what to do with this later. I stuffed everything into the bag and slung it over my shoulders. There was a surprising amount of food scattered around, plenty to share among the 3 herbivores now present. It was similar to our rations, basically tasteless bars of raw nutrition. I doubted all of this was intended to be reserved for just one Gojid. We filed back into line as Tenga wrapped the other end of the rope around his arm. He placed the Gojid behind him, in between him and Grant. She shakily plodded forward, her legs seemed to barely support her. I hoped that with some time, she'd realize the humans were perhaps more civilized than most of the Federation. If a Gojid that was a part of an extermination fleet could come around enough to at least cooperate, there might be hope for some Federation species after all. What they did was unforgivable, but the underlying cause was just sad. All this death was for nothing. Their mission was a pathetic act of ignorance that cost everyone involved an incalculable amount of lives. I hoped there were still some races out there that would stand with us and put an end to this madness. I fell back in behind Grant and in front of Reese and Querek as we continued on our way. The longer we walked, the higher the sun rose in the sky. For the next few hours, the trek was uneventful. We were making decent ground, but the Gojid slowed our pace. She didn't seem injured or otherwise sick. Instead, it seemed she was struggling to move in any manner other than the one dictated by the flood of chemicals washing through her brain. Querek had drifted to sleep in the sling behind me, only to be awakened by every bump along the way, disturbing the stability the sling provided his arm. I was amused at the juxtaposition. One fought to even function in the presence of predators, while the other practically slept in one's arms. The terrain began sloping upward. Grant used the end of his spear to parry away low-hanging branches as Tenga marched straight through them. She said an herbivore chased her onto that rock. What do you think it was? Tenga shrugged. Could have been anything. One of the many questions I'd like answered. He glanced back at the Gojid for a moment. I figure if a single wolf could scare it off, it's probably nothing to worry about. Where did Lucky go anyway? Oh, she'll be back, Reese answered. As they spoke, we began clambering up the side of a hill, weaving between trees and rocks as we ascended. The freshly fallen snow didn't do my grip any favors. I stumbled many times, catching myself on all fours before scrambling to my feet. In front of me, Tenga and Grant hoisted themselves up onto a rocky ledge with their arms. Tenga took the Gojid by the ropes around her paws. She yelped as the predator yanked her up with surprising ease. Grant knelt down and reached out a hand toward me. I took hold and clawed at the stone with my feet as he pulled me up. Reese followed behind. Think this is your stop for now, he said, looking down at Querek. Grant took the Venlil by his healthy arm and pulled him up. Reese followed just behind. From up here, we could see for miles out into the mountains. My breath was taken away as I turned to look behind us. I could see over the alpine forest all the way out to the mountain stream and over the snowy flats. Looming behind them were vast, black mountains dressed in a layer of icy mist that rested just below the peaks. High above, a thin layer of clouds decorated the upper atmosphere, streaking through the deep blue sky like great, white wings resting over the peaks. I could see snow drifts being carried away by the frigid winds along the ridges that split the horizon, making feathery wisps that crowned the top of the mountains as the golden light of Sol beamed through them. The enormity of it all overwhelmed my senses. I felt imperceptibly small, and it seemed I wasn't the only one. I heard Reese take a deep breath next to me, clouding his face in fog. Tenga walked up beside me as he shielded his eyes from the sun. "Wow," was the only whisper that escaped his mouth. Even the Gojid behind him seemed to be stunned as her eyes widened. We took in the sight in silence for a few moments before Grant spoke up behind us. "Guys, over here." He pointed out toward the horizon. I walked over and looked out over the trees. In the far distance, the forest had been replaced by a graveyard of orbital debris, ranging from small scrap piles to entire sections of wrecked ships. It was difficult to discern what faction the vessels belonged to. Any identifying markers were turned to twisted metal. One wreck stood out among the others, however. It appeared to be the entire aft section of a large vessel, planted in the ground vertically. The mangled engines on the other end produced bright flares as fires burned within them. The ship had become a burning beacon. "Think it's worth a look?" Grant asked as he knelt on the ledge. I stood beside him. "I doubt anything down there is worth radiation poisoning. Or worse. The smoke from those engines is poisoning that whole area." Tenga dragged his pack over to a flat rock behind us. "Well, we can rest here. It's time we ate." The Gojid whimpered desperately as she struggled against her restraints. Tenga looked down at her. "Not you. I thought we covered this." As we started gathering wood for the fire, Tenga brought the Gojid a few meters away from the ledge and sat her down, gesturing for me to come over. He sat down across from her. "If I take that rope out of your mouth, can I trust you to be quiet?" The Gojid looked down, glancing up at the predator sporadically as she trembled. Tenga gestured to me. "Vic here would do it. I figure you're far less scared of him than you are of me, as terrifying as he may be." Tenga watched the Gojid for a moment. She seemed defeated. The constant fear had weighed her mind down to the point of exhaustion. Satisfied she wouldn't start screaming immediately, Tenga nodded at me, and I approached. The Gojid's eyes shut tight, and she pulled away slightly as I reached my paws toward her face. I realized this Gojid really was afraid of me. An herbivore. I probably couldn't have hurt her if I'd wanted to. I got a taste of what it was like to be a human in this galaxy, and it wasn't a good feeling. I loosened the knot and pulled the rope down out of her mouth. She eyed me cautiously as I backed away beside Tenga. Not a sound came out of her. A good sign. Tenga sat silently, staring at the prisoner with piercing, predatory eyes. "What's your name?" he asked plainly. The Gojid whimpered weakly at the sound of the human's voice. She hung her head as she gazed at the rocky ground. Tenga sighed. "If you can't even give me a simple name, then we could tie you up and treat you as luggage the rest of the way. You're going to have to answer someone at some point." We stared at the Gojid as words began forming in her voice. She breathed deeply. "Sigra," she said in a weak, trembling voice. "I don't have anything important, I'm nobody, I swear." Tears started forming at the edges of her eyes. Tenga sighed. "Across many of our cultures, it is customary for people to exchange names when making conversation for the first time. I'm Tenga. This is Vickery, we call him Vic." He pointed past me to where the others were getting the fire going. "The one with hair on his face is Reese, the other human is Grant, and the injured Venlil is Querek." Sigra breathed in sharply, "If you're going to torture me or eat me, just do it. I've already covered this. There are rules." Tenga handed me a bar of plant matter. "Ferry this over for me and untie her arms." I gave Tenga a confused look. Tenga returned it. "The only place she could run is off the side of a cliff." I blinked as I walked over and removed the ropes looping around Sigra's wrists. I set the food on the ground next to her as I backed away. "So you really have made the Venlil your slaves," she said sadly. "No. All that talk was a lie to keep you distracted so we could get you down from that rock. Vic has never killed anything, to my knowledge. He just does what I say because I'm his superior officer. And because he trusts me at least a little bit, I hope. I shrugged as I sat back down next to him. He can be very persuasive. Tenga smirked. Anyway, tell me how you found yourself out here. Sigra pulled her legs into her chest. How are rules going to stop you out here? I know you hate me. Answer my question, and I'll answer yours. Tenga sat back against a rock. Sigra looked down. We landed in an escape pod. After the storm blew over, we started moving. We linked up with some other survivors, and then that thing killed everybody. Her voice trailed off. Tenga nodded and leaned forward. It's a miracle you made it this far. I imagine you encountered a lot of predators along the way. Tenga squinted at the Gojid as she shied away from his gaze. The predator nodded as he drew in his bottom lip. Well, I'm a man of my word. To answer your question, yes, I probably could get away with breaking those rules. But I'm an officer. A leader. If I break those rules, the trust I've gained from my men is threatened. If they can't trust me to follow a simple set of ethics, what rules might I break next? Trust is crucial if we're to remain a team. He leaned forward. And believe me, the odds of survival increase exponentially the more friends you have. Tenga stood and approached his bag. He knelt as he rummaged through it. And I have no reason to hate you in particular. You were lied to. Those lies cost both you and me a lot of friends. In that sense, we have a common enemy. So no, I don't hate you, I just, generally dislike you. Sigra seemed perplexed. She watched the predator pull the device we'd recovered from the Gojid's pack from his bag. My turn. Tenga sat back down. What's this? What do you mean I was lied? Wait your turn. Answer the question. The Gojid stammered as she averted Tenga's gaze. She curled into herself as her eyes, once again, peered down at the snow. I don't know, I've never used it. I picked it up from one of the... Her voice quivered. Corpses. I thought so. He set the device down in front of him. You're lying. Sigra's head shot up. What? No. Tenga put out a hand. What did I say about screaming? The Gojid's jaw clenched as she swallowed a breath. You might not be lying about where you got it, but you do know what it does. You wouldn't have risked being mauled by a bear if you didn't. I heard the familiar sizzling sound of meat being cooked on a thin sheet of steel. I looked over to see Reese laying strips of red flesh on a pan over the fire. The air was filled with a sickening aroma as steam rose from the flames. Tenga stood and began approaching the Gojid. So what could be more important than your own survival? So important that you'd lie to a predator's face to keep it a secret? Sigra fell backward as Tenga approached. She curled up into a spiky ball, trembling under the shadow of the giant predator. Tenga knelt down. Sigra's eyes shut tight. That thing will lead me to your friends, won't it? The Gojid panted as she sobbed uncontrollably. Please don't hurt me, she pleaded. Tenga nodded as he picked up the nutrient bar and held it out to her. Eat.